story because in some ways it seems like it's totally from left field. But there's this very cold night you ended up spending up there that seems like in many ways it kind of gave you a taste of some of the themes that would come to really be central in this book.
Yeah, great question. And Molly is one of the few people who's also been to northern Alberta.
Not that far north.
Not that far
Holy
north,
cow.
but still a lot further north than most people who live in Chapel Hill right now. So it's very far north. It was, if you get to the border of Montana and Alberta, and then you drive 15 hours north at full speed on the highway, and then you turn left, and you go for another hour, there's a place called Rainbow Lake. And I was looking for natural gas there. We would get in the helicopter every morning. It would be dark because it's winter. Fly to the site, ride snowmobiles as you're looking, not like looking for natural gas, just like, hey, natural gas. But you like pound stakes into the ground and then like run some electricity through them and see what's up. And then one night, there was a storm that rolled into where we were staying, Rainbow Lake, 40 miles away from the helicopter drop site. And the pilot radioed to say that visibility was too low to pick us up. Not ideal when you're stuck in the bush, minus 10 degrees Celsius. And so we decided we needed to find a place to stay. We built a lean-to in the woods, and I had a Rice Krispie square from my lunch, and I think someone had like a leftover piece of sub. So we passed it around, it was very civilized, around the fire, and then waited till morning. And when morning came, we all slept very poorly. Not surprising, it was so cold. When morning came, we noticed that around the campsite was a set of prints, of paw prints. And we looked a little closer and it was lynx, most likely. Now lynx don't really pose a threat to kind of 5 grown men. But still, I wouldn't totally bet that we were totally safe. And certainly if one was hungry enough and we were sleeping, exposed with our necks bare, who knows? Who knows? And it gave me this sense of like, when you're in the city, place like this, you feel like, the apex predators that science would have us believe we are. But then as soon as you're away from civilization, it's clear that we are not apex predators in the animal kingdom, we're more prey. And so that feeling led to me finding a bunch of anthropological evidence suggesting that we indeed were more prey than predator back in the day. And this sets the stage for how we view, the world today. We're kind of like filled with fear. We're hardwired to see threats, and we import that into politics as well.
This is on its face a little bit counterintuitive, I think, because it seems to me that most of the attempts we read try to explain the culture wars, polarization, various things people lament about our political situation. They tend to appeal to pretty recent history. They appeal to recent events in the economy or a particular personality in politics, this sort of thing. And I mean, I'm a historian, so I would be inclined to go back maybe a few centuries, but you're saying actually to understand 2025, we have to go back millions of years.
Right. I think to understand any kind of political behavior, whether it's today, tomorrow, or yesterday, you need to appreciate that people perceive threats everywhere and that we're kind of hardwired to feel vulnerable and to kind of seek out what's the best way to protect ourselves from these threats. So it's not saying that current trends are not important, like inflation important, gas prices important, immigration, taxes, those can all be important. But the reason those things are important for our political moment is because of a human nature that's wired to see threats in the world and that's focused on protecting ourselves.
So how did you become convinced that that's how we're wired?
There's a couple things. One, there's tons of psychological evidence that the human mind is fixated on threats, right? Like if you're walking home today and out of your eye you see a flash and then it turns out to be a rabid bear and it roars and kind of chases you and then stops at the last minute and runs away, you're safe, thank goodness. But every single time you walk by that place for the rest of your life, you'll be like, that's the bear place. you know, and you'll kind of like wonder what's there, right? So our visual attention at the very lowest level is fixated on threats. But also, my research suggests that when you make your moral judgments, when you condemn acts or people in the world, you condemn them based on how much you think they're harmful, how much damage you think they're doing in the world, how much they're causing suffering. And that's the research that I've done in my lab, right? That no matter what kind of value we're talking about, what hot button issue, we get outraged about that because we think it's causing harm.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about kind of your own path as a scholar of these topics. I mean, I imagine in the training that's involved in becoming a social psychologist, you have to work through a lot of different paradigms, you know, ways different scholars are trying to explain these same problems. So could you talk a little bit about, I don't know, some of the theories that you kind of tried on and maybe found persuasive in some ways or for a time, but then discarded or revised, and why you've ended up where you are and kind of how you understand human nature?
Sure, good question. So when I started out grad school, I started out wondering about the problem of other minds. It's this philosophical problem that argues that each of us are kind of trapped within our own minds ultimately, and that I can never, like, I don't even know if you're conscious right now, right? You could be a robot programmed to ask questions. You don't know, right? Like with undergrads, I tell them, right, like, you know, you could be dating someone and you could kiss them and they could say, you know, you're a good kisser, but actually they think you're a terrible kisser. You know, you're like the worst kisser in the world. And it's always good to have some kind of like, you know, doubt about yourself. And so this matters for morality because, you know, I don't know for certain whether, let's say, a dog, right, has a mind and deserves protection. Like you probably think your dog has a rich mind, but other people might not, you know, and maybe other people are like, yeah, you could eat that dog and it wouldn't matter, it's fine. And so this kind of questions of morality revolving around the mental states of others, that comes to bear on things like vegetative patience, on, you know, even questions of God, right? What does God think? Turns out God thinks probably exactly what you think, that's convenient. Right? Like if you're pro-marijuana, you're like, God is definitely pro-weed. And if you're anti-marijuana, you're like, God is definitely anti-marijuana, right? So this is, again, the problem of other minds here. And so that's where I started. And every time I kind of studied a moral question or dilemma, it turned out that people made their moral judgments based on how much they thought it involved harm or pain or something like that. Even moral judgments that revolved around scenarios that didn't seem to involve harm or pain. And so,
what's an example?
Yeah, exactly. So I'll give you an example. There's so many examples to choose from. There's like mild ones, like eating pizza off a corpse. We've all been there. But the classic one is about a brother and a sister.
Oh no, you're going to tell this story.
Do you not want the story?
Go ahead.
This is the classic story. This is Jonathan Haidt's story. So if you know Jonathan Haidt, best-selling author, this one is from him. Mark and Julie are brother and sister. They go into the mountains for spring break, whatever, and then, you know, they're hanging out. It's lots of fun. And then they decide, they start to kiss, and that's nice. And then, oh wow, that's nice. And then it keeps going, and then eventually they make love. Mark wears a condom, Julie's on birth control. They never talk about it again. They only do it once. They never tell their parents. It's great. It's harmless. By definition, I'm saying it's harmless. And yet, people still condemn this act despite it being harmless. And so the field of moral psychology says, here is a harmless act. There must be a reason to condemn it beyond harm because people still see it as wrong. Should make sure my kids aren't here talking about consensual incest. I don't want to scar their little minds. But in my kind of scholarly journey, every time I kind of ask people about this question and others like it, people still saw some amount of harm. They didn't believe the experimenter that having sex with your sibling is in fact totally harmless. Right? They were like, I just don't believe that it is, right? I'm going to withhold judgment maybe a little bit. They still get a visceral sense of its kind of harmfulness. And so my work really revealed that even if moral psychologists say that many things are harmless, if you look at the psychology and you look at their kind of visceral experience of the world, and there's lots of ways you can do that, you find that people condemn acts based on how harmful they feel. And I think that's important because questions of harm are not objective, that philosophers or even moral psychologists might argue. Instead, they're subjective, and each of us perceives harm in our own way, according to our upbringing, and in a very visceral way, and that's what drives our moral judgments.
I have a lot of questions about this. I mean, and some of this, Kurt and I have a lot of fun conversations because we are interested in many of the same questions, but we come at them like very different methods. And so when you're doing surveys with a scenario like that, I mean, first of all, how I think of social psychology as really having to draw on the survey population that is close at hand. So American college students, like generally, I mean, how do you extrapolate?
Historically.
How do you extrapolate, to a kind of grand theory of how people in an entire culture or even beyond that, in some sort of sense that's tied to our human nature, if the survey sample is limited by kind of what you can execute in your lab?
Yeah. So I think there is traditionally a sense of psychology studies being done with college undergrads. Interestingly enough, the claim that people condemn harmless wrongs was made by using college students. Like that's how John Haidt's population. So I think it is relevant for the particular argument here by using a similar set, right? College students also condemn things that they feel is harmful is what I found. But you can use big online studies to get across kind of Americans in general, representative samples. I think you can also look back in a kind of anthropological record to make sense of these things. So another parallel trend that was arguing against the power of harm in our moral minds was kind of anthropological accounts, ethnographies from Brahmin Indians, let's say. So there's a sect of Brahmin Indians who appear to condemn acts that many Western folks think are not harmful and not immoral. And so let's say eating, it's like some kids that I know. So if an eldest son eats chicken after his father's funeral, some Brahmin Indians think that that is wrong. And yet it's harmless, at least according to Western anthropologists and moral psychologists. But I think if you actually ask people in that culture, what does it mean if an eldest son eats chicken after his father's funeral? They will tell you that their kind of like worldview is that the eldest son has to process his father's death pollution by eating a vegetarian diet, and if by eating chicken, he stops processing the death pollution and basically condemns his father's soul to eternal suffering, right? Like that's the punchline. And so for these folks who condemn this act, they don't see it as harmless at all. They see it as in fact harmful, and that's why they view it as wrong. So I think you can look in other cultures and reveal that questions of harm map onto questions of morality as well. I think, even if you look at college undergrads too, you can do particular experiments in the lab. And I think that gives you kind of the ability to make inferences that you can't do with just like asking them. And so we've done experiments where there's a kind of fun experiment to run where we have people simulate harmful actions in the lab. Like give people a replica handgun with like weight, it's like a real feeling handgun, and cock it back and shoot someone in the face, which is harmless. But you give an undergrad this and you say, it's okay, you can do this. The person you're shooting is an accomplice and we know it's a fake gun. And we've shown you it's not loaded. We've shown you there's no bullets. We've shown there's no place for bullets. And they still hesitate, right? And they still get this visceral reaction. We're like, no, it's cool. But still implicitly, right, they feel like it's harmful and they feel like it's wrong to do it. And we have other studies where we connect those feelings, that kind of visceral feeling of harm, to moral condemnation. And so, you can imagine the same thing if I brought in, a college student brother and sister, and I'm like, no, it's okay. It's perfectly harmless. Sure, they probably wouldn't want to do it, but also they'd be like, I just don't believe that it's harmless, And so there's so many things you can do in the lab. You can do, various other procedures to show that these like visceral feelings of harm persist and drive moral judgment.
It's so thought-provoking to have you connect the example of Brahmin Indian purity rules and views of the afterlife with some, this more contemporary lab setting. I mean, it's making me think about the need to be clear about how we define harm. And I'm wondering if you think, number one, is there a clear definition that works in all cases? And second, is there any hazard in defining it too broadly, especially if, even in these cases where this is these are anthropologists going and analyzing another culture, in this case, Brahmin Indians. These are probably largely Western trained academics who come out of a culture in which, since the mid-late 18th century, the idea of the harm principle has been really central to defining, how we think about the boundaries of personal liberty and kind of our discourse. And so is what's happening there really Western social scientists translating a different culture that does not understand things in the language of harm into language that Western secular social scientists can understand?
Good question. And you're absolutely right that the harm principle has loomed large in concerns about morality, right? Trying to reveal a kind of normative truth on how people should make decisions, utilitarianism, like grounded in questions of harm. I think you're absolutely right that Western scientists have projected Western ideals as well onto other cultures, but in the exact opposite way you're saying, right? And so Western folks go over there and they're like, oh, this culture, they're not making judgments based on harm because it doesn't seem harmful to me, right? It seems totally harmless, right? Eating chicken. That's just something that everyone does at funerals in America. It's great, Like I was just at a funeral not too long ago and they serve fried chicken. Great, Americans love it. It's delicious. It's a comfort food. But overseas in other cultures, right? I think Western anthropologists are projecting this idea of like, well, maybe they're accepting that it seems immoral, but they're not accepting the idea that it could seem harmful. And I think that's because they split the idea of morality from harm and see them as two different kind of things. And I'm seeing them as very similar, which is like a kind of visceral perception of suffering, of damage, of mistreatment, of victimization. But to your first point about, the worry of broadening harm beyond where it's useful or maybe unfalsifiably, I think my reply to that is, well, I'm not defining it in any way, in a sense, right? I'm not the one as a scientist saying like, well, I'm saying it's harmful. I'm not saying it's harmful in the sense of like, I'm not the one projecting harm on particular acts, but it's the people themselves that are condemning it that see it as harmful. So I think I'm taking people's perception at face value in the same way that social science researchers take their judgments of morality at face value. So I think moral psychology has long emphasized that questions of morality are in the mind of the beholder and the eye of the perceiver. And we should take people from different cultures, from different subcultures like conservatives, evangelicals, at their word that they see something as immoral. It'd be weird to be like, you think this is immoral? You're wrong. You don't think it is immoral. And so I think we've accepted kind of subjectivity of morality in social science. And if you wanted to say like, all I'm doing is just saying, well, we should think of harm the same way we think of morality, as a visceral perception that's rapid and intuitive, that varies by culture.
But that's really interesting. So you're saying actually to use the language of harm to talk about these moral categories is a way of taking them seriously, taking the claims seriously. Like there's a way in which the Western secular materialist anthropologist who listens to the Brahmin interlocutor and doesn't use the language of harm, they're not taking seriously that person's sincere convictions about what's going to happen to their father in the hereafter.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
That makes sense.
At a kind of deeper level, right? You'd be like, oh yeah, you're using harm as a metaphor, and I think they're like, no, it's not a metaphor. Like the reason I do this is because I'm concerned about my father's soul. So the example I'll give is with evangelical conservatives when questions of gay marriage came up at the Supreme Court. So there was this idea among liberal academics, moral psychologists, that conservatives were concerned about passing gay marriage because it was a purity question, because God forbid it, full stop. It was not about harm at all. And so they designed a number of stories, psychology studies, to link questions of morality about gay marriage to the feeling of disgust and to questions of purity. And so people think that disgust is tied to purity in the field. And so they thought it was not about harm. And we ran a bunch of studies where we asked people kind of like to make judgments about gay marriage. We put them under time pressure, so they have to respond very quickly. It's a way of getting at people's intuitions. There's other ways you can do it too. And what we found is that when people were put under time pressure, kind of conservative folks especially were likely to say that there's harm in gay marriage. And this argument of harm in things like the advance of gay rights goes back, and I'm not saying I agree with this, obviously, but there's this long tradition among conservative Christians like Anita Bryant, was a country western singer who wrote a book called The Anita Bryant Story, The Threat of, I think, Militant Homosexuality to America, something like that. And she thought that what would happen is, people would be gay. It would be awesome. Basically, I'm like paraphrasing. She wouldn't frame it like this. They would like drive by playgrounds and like cool convertibles because they have lots of disposable income because they don't usually have kids. And then other kids would be like, oh my God, it's so awesome to be gay. Let's be gay, Jimmy. And then they would like start making out and they would be like, let's not have kids either because kids are a drag. Oh, my kids are here. And then America's family would be destroyed because no one would have kids anymore. And like, I'm obviously like running roughshod over this argument, but there was a legitimate concern about harm to America's family in the evangelical opposition to gay marriage. And so after we published that research, I wrote an op-ed in the Times. I only have two, unlike you. But this op-ed in the Times argued that, like, look, evangelical conservatives do see harm in the kind of advance of gay rights. And I got lots of emails from like an evangelical pastor who's like, thank you for recognizing that, like, I'm opposed to this, not just because I think God said it so, like I'm not a sheep just like following the words of the Bible, because I think the words of the Bible help us best protect ourselves and our society.
I want to pin this down though. So harm doesn't always involve physical suffering? Because that seems like the harm, you have harm to the family. Would they frame that in terms of physical suffering? Can you give this you frame it as a definition that would apply here?
I mean, I think harm is a flexible category in people's minds. I think of like love. I think of like a lot of these like really deep and powerful emotions that people feel, or like, what is God? Like these things, does it have to come down to like corporeal form or not? I don't know. But I think with harm, there's a spectrum, and on one end there's like, taking a walk on the beach, obviously not harmful. And I think the other end of the spectrum is almost always grounded in physical harm, right? And emotional suffering, genocide, right? Like the torture of children. Like these are things that we all agree are harmful. And even if kind of the acts that are more in the middle, maybe the advance of gay rights in the eyes of some evangelical conservatives, are, like drug use is another one. Even if those might not cause physical harm immediately, where the buck stops is still kind of emotional or physical harm, right? Families torn apart, kids crying, people using drugs, not taking care of their kids crying. It always comes down to think of the children, no matter what kind of thing we're thinking of, right? Immigration, there's like kids at the border, right, who are suffering because they're taken from their parents. There's young adults who are murdered in New Jersey because an illegal immigrant comes over as part of our cartel and kills them, right? It always comes down to kids being hurt.
Because we're looking for like the pure victim.
That's right.
Right. One would think, as American society at least has generally become a physically safer place for most people, that we would see a kind of diminution of this instinct to have that prey reflex. But in your book, you talk about how that's not happening. That's not how we're responding to the relative physical security that we benefit from compared to generations in the past. What's going on? Why is that?
So we are as safe now as we've ever been as a society. right? If you had to pick a time, I think Pinker says this, if you had to pick a time to be born, you should probably pick now, even though there's global warming, even though there's wars, right? Like healthcare is the best it's ever been, right? We have as much physical safety as we can and have ever had. Although we can always have more. I should say we can always be safer, we can always be better, we can always be more equal, right? Less oppression, etc. At the same time, even though, you know, the moral circle is kind of expanding and we're treating people more fairly in general, and, you know, we give dogs sweaters, you know, when they used to just be like property, right? Like we care more about more things and more people, and I think that's good, and we're safer. We have seatbelts, we have airbags, but we don't feel that way, right? Because we're so hardwired to find threats. And so anytime we have this like physiological urge to detect something and something becomes less prevalent, the concept of what counts as that category creeps. And so a good example is food, right? We are hardwired to need to eat. If some kinds of food become less prevalent, right? If like we didn't have grocery stores, it was a post-apocalyptic society, and now there's like, there's no food, but there's a tin of cat food, be like, yum. Mm-hmm. That is food. Cat food is not human food today, but it could be if we run out of other fresh produce. And so with kind of our understanding of harm, the same thing happens. There's fewer obvious harms that we face every day, again, despite there being obviously too many harms in society, right? Like I talked to my mom not so long ago about growing up in northern Canada in the 50s and 60s. And you know, kids would die getting trapped in fridges. There was a kid who was like in the backseat of a car on the highway, and there was no child locks, and he just opened the door and rolled out and died. Like a house burned down because they had candles on the Christmas tree. They lived behind a lake. You know, kids drowned every year. I mean, like, right, it's much safer to raise kids. And so because we're not worried about like that quite as much, we see harm to kids in terms of overprotecting them, or are they using too many screens? I mean, these are real concerns for parents today, and I worry about them with my kids. But if you went back to the time of the Industrial Revolution, where kids were getting their hands cut off by spinning jennies, and we're like, you know what the biggest problem for your kid is? Overprotecting them. Watching screens with moving things. Parents would be like, I just want my kids to keep their hands when they come home, you know? And so I think there's this creep of harm because it's getting less frequent, and that makes us not only see more things as harmful, but see more things as immoral.
Well, and is the tendency to talk about use of some kinds of language as violence? I mean, is that part of the phenomenon you're describing, and is that maybe even more germane to our ability or inability to have conversations across political difference, if even to raise certain topics or entertain certain questions is cast as a form of harm?
That's right. So in the absence of a lot of physical harm that we're encountering every day, we see things as like speech as harmful, expressions as harmful. And I want to say like these things have been cast as kind of like progressive concerns, but I've talked to folks and it's like really everybody. Right? I remember being in an event sitting next to a prominent kind of conservative psychologist, and he was lamenting the fact that like as one of the sole conservatives in his department, it was really hard for him. And you know, as he was walking down the hall, people were giving him kind of like weird looks and like not inviting him to parties. And I turned to him and I'm like, oh, it sounds like you maybe need a safe space from the microaggressions you're perceiving in the hall. He's like, I mean, no. And so, you know, I think there's just like this tendency for it to creep on all sorts of ways. And, you know, we have our kind of like political talking points, but I think everyone is kind of guilty of this creep of harm.
One thought I had as I was reading your book is this just drives home how, despite our veneer, you know, here we are in this bookstore filled with, you know, these volumes that capture all these, you know, endeavors in human knowledge, but we are not rational. Like we are hanging on to rationality by our fingertips most of the time. It's kind of one of the main takeaways for me in your book, and our reasoning is so often in the service of these deeper instincts that are formed by millions of years of history. What are the practical implications of your research? I mean, is there some set of mental practices we can engage in to begin to counteract this tendency that we have to see harm maybe where it isn't, put artificial barriers between us and understanding other perspectives?
Yeah, I think appreciating our kind of harm-based mind can help us better bridge divides and be more empathic to people who disagree with us, right? So humans are very tribal, right? It's like very easy to have an in-group and out-group. We're like literally divided today by like red versus blue. It's like it's a color, like which color are you? Which like left or right? I mean, I know there's like deep things underneath there, but it's very easy to divide people. And so I think what you can do, at first is to understand the other side, anyone you're disagreeing with, it doesn't have to be politics, is to think about like, what are the harms that they see in this situation that maybe I don't see? Who are the victims they're concerned about? How do they feel victimized? Like a lot of our kind of moral arguments in daily life with your partner, with your friends, with your coworkers is about someone feels victimized, and then you also feel victimized, and like, who's the real victim here? And then you're off to the races in terms of an argument. And so if you can understand the harms that people see, then I think that helps understand. And then the way you get people to see the harms that you see is by telling stories. And so maybe we can talk about, because I know you're big in the Enlightenment and rationality, and I don't know if that's rational or not, but let me tell you a study that we ran, which is we asked people, imagine you're having a conversation with someone you disagree with about politics, and imagine what would make you respect them. What would they say in a conversation to make you respect them? All right, think about it. When we asked people, the majority said, I want them to use facts. If they use the facts and not like editorializing, not like, I don't know, other stuff, then I will respect them. We say, great, here are some facts. And they say, not those facts, right? Those are not the right facts. I want the right facts, the facts that support my viewpoint. And so it turns out competing media systems, right, different echo chambers on social media, everyone's got their own facts, there's fake facts. And so it turns out what helps people see the harms that you're worried about are stories, particularly stories about suffering, about vulnerability. If I say the reason that I'm pro-gun is not because here's how many people defend themselves with guns in America every year, but because my mom used a gun to defend herself from an invader or an attacker, you'll think, okay, right? Like I'll give you the benefit of the doubt now. I understand, even though we disagree, how you're concerned about protecting yourself, how you're concerned about harm. And I think that's the first step for a better conversation, these kind of stories of harm.
That makes sense, and I know there are groups that are using some version of this model. Like I'm thinking of the organization Braver Angels, which brings together self-identified conservatives and self-identified progressives, and tries to get them talking in large part by encouraging them to, talk about their grandmothers and do things like this, like let's reveal our common human experiences. And I that makes sense to me. But at a certain point, like, don't you run up against the limits of that if you and I occupy different realities? Like at a certain point, if you actually want to make headway in persuading somebody to change their mind on a policy position, don't you have to confront the facts, the gap there?
You do, but I think you want to start with facts slowly and after sharing stories, and people don't do this. So the typical political conversation goes like this. Oh, you voted for this person? Well, don't you realize that this many people are suffering right now in like this statistic, right? There's no space for stories at all. There's no space for personal experiences, and there's no space for understanding. And so I think even the desire to persuade, it's natural, and you need to kind of come to compromise to advance policy goals. But I think it's not a good place to start a political conversation, right? You're like, how do I win here? We're like sitting around the Thanksgiving dinner table, and you're like, oh, here's my uncle. he's got that red hat. Well, I'm going to win right now. I've got this doozy of a stat I heard on NPR. I'm going to crush him. You know, and you're like, hey, uncle, here's this thing I heard on NPR. And then your uncle, of course, is like, I give up, you're right. Wow. I'm just like, I'm wrong about my vote. I'm wrong about immigration. Thank you. You know, that never happens. Right? And so I think if you go into conversations trying to understand where someone's coming from, oh, like that makes sense to me. Now I see where you're coming from. Then you can have some common ground where you can maybe talk about persuasion. You can talk about compromise. There's an organization that gets like legislators together to try to achieve kind of like common political goals that everyone agrees on, like making it so that someone who has emergency medical care doesn't cause them to go bankrupt. Left, right, people agree on that. You shouldn't go bankrupt because you break an arm or your kid gets hurt. To get those legislators in the same room, one, you have to make it secret, which is sad. You know, you like can't publish their names, at least not immediately. And then you have to give them like a day of talking to each other to bond about their common experiences, where they went to school, where they like fishing, stuff like that. And then once they have their kind of common goodwill, then you can be like, well, let's think about the facts here. Like what kind of healthcare policies would reduce medical bankruptcies and so forth. So facts are important. But I think we just severely underestimated how important kind of mutual connection and storytelling is.
Do you think that that really needs to happen in interpersonal kind of face-to-face contexts? And is social media, the internet, really the enemy here? Or are there any internet contexts, I don't know, long-form podcasts or something that lend themselves to this kind of storytelling approach to bridge building?
Yeah, I think it is important for everyday people to do it, bridge divides. It's not easy, it's hard, and if you want to do it, you have to be the one who kind of like swallows the bitter pill first. It's like never fun to be the one who first like listens and, you know, oh, you're a baby killer. Interesting. You know, like be like, yeah, you know, that's a perspective. It's an interesting one. Like maybe you could tell me like how you arrive at these views, right? It's like hard when someone attacks you to kind of like turn the other cheek in a sense and try to like draw out their understanding. But I think it's necessary. And I do think that social media is terrible for this, especially when social media sites have algorithms to kind of like capture attention and drive outrage. So X, Facebook, which no longer has fact checking, and all these other kind of like, you know, personal sites where you yell vitriol at each other. But I do think longer form things like Reddit, there's a moderator. I think that really helps, even if they can be divisive. Front Porch Forum, I think it's called, is like a heavily moderated site. I think they're in like Vermont. And you have to reply asynchronously. So you can't like see something and like tweet at it and then tweet at it back. You have to like give yourself some time to cool down before you reply. And I do think podcasts where you tell stories and you learn about someone is another good thing to do. So anything that kind of, you know, as you say, like grasping at rationality, anything that kind of like intervenes with our like angry primitive instincts of yelling at the other person, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm with you on the value of stories, and I don't want to suggest that stories are in opposition to rationality, but I think we are storytelling creatures, and humans are constantly looking for a story to insert ourselves into and attach meaning to the chaos, right? So I think you're leaning into a structure that's fairly natural, and that, you know, deployed in the right way is not mutually exclusive with being in touch with reality.
Right. And some folks often say, you know, when I do podcasts, like, well, aren't there like organizations, like political operatives who are using storytelling of harm for their nefarious ends, who are weaponizing victimhood and, you know, relying on people's fears to get them to vote or donate? Absolutely. I mean, and this is why they're doing it, because questions of harm, questions of victimhood are so powerful. But it'd be nice for us to use it for good too, and not just evil that they're doing. So I think it's important that we recognize it and deploy these strategies to connect with others and to feel less divided and not just follow the kind of conflict entrepreneurs, as they're called by Amanda Ripley, right? Just to like try to reestablish some compassion.
Now's probably a great time to invite audience questions.
Yeah, I'm interested in sort of taking the philosophy approach. What are the assumptions that sort of lead you to want to have this political project of like bridging divides between Democrats and Republicans? Because obviously there are many different ways that you could think about like building social ties, and I'm interested how you came at it that way.
Interesting. So why I'm committed to kind of bridging divides between the left and right?
Yes.
It's a good question. So I'm part of this organization called the New Pluralists, and their kind of founding ethos is that America is a pluralistic democracy, and not always a fair one, certainly, and not always the best in many cases, but it's better than a dictatorship, and that by kind of balancing various interests, we can better arrive at the truth, and at goodness, and at like moving our moral progress forward. And so I just think if you want to achieve things and you want to make the world a better place, then you need to kind of like engage all people and try to see where they're coming from. And of course, there are anti-pluralists out there. And then the question is, what do you do with them? Like, what do you do with a KKK member? Do they belong at the table? Do they get votes? I mean, they get votes in America. And then I don't know. Like, I don't know if I have that much compassion for white supremacists, but there are folks who do. So Daryl Davis is a black blues musician who's made it kind of his life work to befriend KKK members, to get them to hang up their robes, to, you know, try to understand where they're coming from, understand the threats that they see, to kind of not agree with them, obviously, but kind of like make them feel heard and understood. And then through that process, kind of de-radicalize them and make them not white supremacists anymore. And so, you know, these are difficult questions that we each must face, but I think that like he's doing a heroic thing and working towards a pluralistic democracy. So, yeah.
So you talked about like how certain people or populations will find one thing harmful and others will not. I wonder if you've studied or know any studies that have looked at sources in a person's life that contribute to that definition of harm for them. Like you talked a bit about a cultural perspective, but are there other sources that define what's harmful for someone?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's almost, you know, social psychology is, what do you call it? A nomothetic kind of discipline. It's like just big on aggregate data. And it's not a kind of idiographic discipline, which is like thinking of individual life courses and like what might shape kind of someone's individual assumptions about this. But it's certainly the case that like parents, political figures, churches, like the things that, you know, raise people, help shape those sources of perceived harm. The work that we've done has looked at kind of like broad strokes, kind of like liberals versus conservatives, and who they see as particularly harmful, or likely to be harmed or victimized. And what we find is that there's lots of differences, but maybe we'll stick to two groups. One group is the powerful, corporate leaders, CEOs, state troopers. And another group is what we call the othered, kind of like borrow the term of, you know, someone who's outside the center of society. Think of people from more marginalized or minoritized groups, like trans people, undocumented immigrants, Muslims, people from racial minority categories. And so if you ask people, how much are people from these categories especially likely to be mistreated or victimized? Everyone agrees that folks from the othered, quote, are more likely to be victimized than folks who are powerful. It's like inherent in that category. But progressives see a huge difference between those groups. So the othered, incredibly vulnerable, right? They're incredibly oppressed, incredibly susceptible to victimization, really based on group identity. The powerful, not at all vulnerable, right? And what that means is if, let's say, a CEO of a healthcare insurance company is assassinated, progressives are like, screw that dude. You know, like he didn't suffer at all. We can all rejoice that an oppressor has been eliminated. On the other hand, more committed conservatives they still see the difference between the kind of othered and the powerful in terms of potential victimization, but that difference is very small. Like we're talking like a half or a fifth of a point kind of on a 5-point scale, whereas like progressives are like 3 points, you know? And so if you think that everyone is kind of equally vulnerable to harm, if you think not in terms of groups, but in terms of individual identities, then it makes sense to be, let's say, against affirmative action, right? It's like, it doesn't matter what group you're a part of. Like everyone is sad when they don't get into college. Everyone can bleed if they're cut. And so you get these like really different kind of assumptions about how to view the world and what's fair and who's vulnerable to harm. And I think that explains a lot. But I do think that the digging in more into kind of assumptions of like, you know, questions of harm are really important.
So how might inequality, economic inequality, play into some of our differences, our divides that we find ourselves in today? I just finished reading The Broken Ladder. So.
Oh yeah, I was going to say you should read The Broken Ladder by my colleague Keith Payne. He's just down the hall from me. We lift weights together. He can lift many more weights than I can. But I think it's exactly right? His argument is that inequality is just generally bad. When people live in especially unequal societies, then, you know, they're more likely to do terrible things. They're more likely to take terrible risks. So buy scratch-off tickets, buy luxury things that don't necessarily help them survive. But I think, you know, questions of inequality can also kind of push apart what people see as harmful, right? In particular, if you're like in the top of the broken ladder, right? You're more fixated on perhaps like the harms that you might face, maybe first world harms, you could say, right? And you kind of lack empathy for people who are more suffering. There's this quote from a scene in Arrested Development. It's like this, you know, old show, and there's a, you know, rich, I forget her name, the very rich woman. She's like, how much does a banana cost? I don't know, like $10? You know, and of course bananas don't cost $10. They cost much less, but just like this lack of compassion for the other side has become separated. And so I think inequality is not a great thing for these divides. It's a good question. It's a good book, recommend it.
I'm curious, have you done research on how best to convince someone that something is not as harmful as they think it is?
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, because these feelings of harm are so visceral, it's very difficult. And so one example from politics is, right, again, think of like gay marriage, right? So there was a time that folks on the left, kind of like those who were advancing kind of gay rights in America, were like, let's emphasize that gay marriage is harmless, right? So you like argue to conservatives, you're like, no, it's like totally harmless. It's cool, like it's totally harmless. But you like can't combat feelings of harm with just saying that like it's not there, right? And so I think what was actually effective was using competing perceptions of harm, which are, you know, there are people who can't marry the person they love, and when their spouse dies, they like don't have rights, and they like can't have a family, and it's so hard for them, right? This like you have to showcase, or like they have kids, and their kids are like suffering because they like, you know, they can't love the person they love, and so you like need to combat harm with harm in a way, which is not easy to do. But I do think it's true, and this is like from clinical psychology, that like exposure therapy like is often the way to do it for more immediate harms. Like where I went to grad school, there was a lab that studied fears of spiders. And so people come in and they're like, oh, spiders are gonna get me. And they're like, well, here's a picture of a spider. You know, here's a video of a spider. And then at the very end, like session 13, they had to hold a pink tarantula named Rosie. And people did. You know, these like spider-phobic people were holding tarantulas. And so I think if you are convinced that it is truly harmless, then you can expose people to it and they will habituate to the harm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think lots of insights from clinical psychology there.
I have a question about the relationship we have to our visceral reactions. On this gay marriage question, I spent a lot of time studying American evangelicals, and I mean, there's a really interesting generational shift happening on this question. And I would say it is probably true as a generalization that an older generation of American evangelicals did have a kind of visceral reaction to gay marriage, homosexual activity. But I think that is that's really fading out among younger evangelicals, and they're very likely to know gay people, to know transgender people, to have these people among their close friends. And many of them who I talk to, they're actually fighting their visceral feeling. The visceral feeling they have is very much in favor of wanting to expand the circle of we, wanting to reinterpret scripture, but they're pretty seriously committed to a straightforward traditional reading of the relevant passages from scripture that they just feel stuck by. So what's the right way to understand those kinds of Christians? Are they still, would you read them as trapped by like an older generation's idea of harm?
I guess the question, as I was asked earlier too, is like there's a competing sense of harm there too, right? It's like, why follow church doctrine? Why hew to the teachings of the church, right? Why follow this previous generation? What is the value in tradition?
Because the idea would be God wants what's best for humanity, and we shouldn't trust our visceral reactions.
Exactly.
I see, yeah.
Right. Like the fear and loathing. What's the Bible story? Isaac and Abraham, like, commanded to kill. Am I doing this right? What's the Bible story?
Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac.
Yeah, exactly. Right, like commanded to do so, and not following God blindly just because he said so, but because there's a sense and trust that God knows what's right and what's best. And so I think there the internal war is not just about like my visceral feeling that, that I like gay people and they're good, and someone just told me so, like mom and dad, like, ugh. But I think the visceral reaction is like this war of like, how do I prioritize these harms? How do I make sense of like how best to foster, a better, more thriving society? And I don't think, again, these are always necessarily like able to be articulated in an explicit sense, but I think that's what's kind of happening internally.
That seems really important to recognize that probably all of us have these competing senses of harm that are kind of contesting and not always in a clear hierarchy, and maybe in one season of life one has a stronger pull than another. That maybe helps us see one another as more complicated.
Absolutely. And in fact, I work with an organization called Essential Partners, and there's some pioneers in the space of like bridging divides, especially after communities have violence. So Essential Partners started when there was a shooting at an abortion clinic in Massachusetts. And I think what they do, and as part of their work, one is they use kind of insights from family therapy, which is like, look, you want to have a connection with a community member, you want to have a stable community, and so there's this desire there to connect and understand. And that's what I've talked a little bit about, right? Like trying to understand the harms they see. But the other thing they do is they ask people, once they feel comfortable, to entertain the tensions or competition and values within themselves about issues. And everyone has some competition about issues, even if they don't talk about them on like social media, right? So if you're thinking about immigration, I'm an immigrant, right? I'm like very pro-immigration. I'm even pro like dreamers. I'm pro undocumented, right? I'm like very progressive when it comes to immigration. But then if you like really get me to think about it, and I think about like, I heard a story of a rancher in Texas who can't keep his lights on at night because like migrants will come and like, to his house, they'll see it, they'll like take his food, right? They'll like steal his livestock or whatever, right? And it's like very hard for him, and he's like worried all the time. And now I'm like, okay, like I feel that, I kind of feel that, like I want to protect my family. I wouldn't want people slamming on my window while I'm trying to sleep. My kids are in the bedroom next to me. And so I think entertaining that like people also have complexity within them, I think is also really important, in addition to understanding the complexity of others.
I think we have time for one more question.
Is there a genetic component to some of our differences between liberals and conservatives? Are brains the same?
There's been some studies arguing of brains, so some like volume differences, some like white matter differences. People like talking about the amygdala as a source of like fear, and conservatives, like, do they have bigger amygdalas? The amygdala is not the source of fear, right? The amygdala is the source of like a salience network where you like detect changes. I think there's really scant evidence that any of these differences carry on to our brains beyond the fact that I'm not a dualist. And of course, everything that's psychologically different within us is reflected somehow in our brains, right? Like every time you have a thought, that's a brain thing. And so it's, I think, trivially true that our brains reflect our psychology, but I don't think there's like a systematic way that the brains of liberals or conservatives differ, or genes. I mean, we're like 99% chimpanzee and bonobo, and so I think the hunt for like a conservative or a liberal gene, I think is probably not going to end with a discovery.
Even in terms of personality differences?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a book called The Political Animal by A.V. Schuchman, and he argues that there are some differences that lend folks to be more liberal or conservative, or at least correlate, I would say. So conservatives are more likely to have a kind of a pessimistic view of human nature, kind of man is fallen in a sense, and maybe liberals are more like Rousseauian in a sense of like we're born good and free. And
isn't that sort of tautological? I mean, those are key components of your definition of
exactly
conservative. Exactly.
So this is why I feel like there's a book coming out called The Ideological Brain. It's coming out in a couple months. I'm very excited to read that book because I have the same question, right? I explain how liberals and conservatives make sense of the world differently when it comes to harm and morality, but I don't really know about the ultimate roots of liberalism and conservatism beyond the fact that like how you're raised, or maybe like one's more functional when we're like peaceful and one's more functional when we're like in conflict. There's like different tolerances of inequality if you're conservative, but again, it's kind of tautological, it's definitional. And so I guess the short answer is, and I preach humility when it comes to like moral understanding, is that I don't really know.
Well, and I appreciate that your book emphasizes kind of common features across human nature.
Right.
And there is something perhaps dangerous in this quest for hardwired biological differences between political categories. Because if you discover that, or you think you've discovered that, there's your excuse to never engage.
Right, exactly. So there's this...
Or to go to violence.
Exactly, yeah, go to violence, right?
There's no hope if that's where you land.
Even in people's minds, so there's another theory that I argue against, that argues that liberals and conservatives have like deeply different minds or different foundations, and that conservatives have an advantage when it comes to morality. And not only do I think that theory is totally wrong because of much research that I've done, but I think it's dangerous. Because if you tell half of America that you have an advantage when it comes to morality, you're better. I don't think I really talk about this in the book. I think I cut it out as like a little incendiary, but I do think there is a sense of you're like, look, you're better than them. You're more moral than them. Like that's the beginning of a kind of conflict that could ultimately lead to
slavery.
Yeah, right, genocide, whatever, right? Rwanda, right? One side's telling the other side like you're more moral. The Troubles, all these conflicts, right, that flare into violence, like moral superiority. And so I think
that's a cleansing.
Yeah, right. So it's better just to say, like, look, we differ, we have the same moral mind, we disagree on some kind of assumptions that feed into that question about harm. But at the end of the day, we're all caring about the same thing, and we can all find common ground.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Please join me in thanking Kurt for this great conversation.